The wind on Dorland's Reach never stopped. It came from the east every morning, dry and full of red dust, and it pushed against the broken fences of the human outpost like it wanted to knock the whole place down. Daniel Holt had learned to walk with his shoulder turned into it, his boots cracking over dry ground as he made his way to the scrapyard where he worked every single day. He did not think about the wind anymore. After 6 years on this planet, a man stopped noticing the things that could not be changed. The scrapyard was where broken machines went to die, and where humans went to spend their lives fixing what the Kesh did not want to fix themselves. Daniel was good with his hands. He always had been, even back on the ship that crashed here before he was old enough to remember much of it. He could take apart a fuel pump blind and put it back together faster than any Kesh technician, but that skill only meant the guards gave him more work, not less. That morning, an alarm rang out from the eastern ridge, 3 short bursts that meant a supply transport had gone down in the wastes. Daniel was pulled from his bench along with 4 other men and sent out with a cart to strip anything useful from the wreck before the desert sand buried it for good. Nobody complained. Complaining earned you a smaller ration and a longer shift, and Daniel had learned that lesson early. The wreck sat half buried in a dry riverbed, its hull cracked open like an egg. It had been a Kesh transport, the kind used to move live cargo between processing stations. Daniel could tell before he even got close because the smell hit him first, sharp and animal, mixed with burned metal. He climbed over a twisted support beam and looked down into the broken hold, expecting nothing but corpses. What he found instead made him stop breathing for a second. In the corner of the crushed hold, half covered by a torn crate, something small was moving. It was curled tight, its ash-gray scales dulled with dust and dried blood, one wing bent at a wrong angle. Daniel had seen Scytharn before, mostly from a distance, chained to work carts or flying overhead with Kesh riders on their backs. He had never seen one this small, and he had never seen one look this afraid. The other men were already picking through the wreck for parts, calling out what they found. Nobody else had looked into the hold. Daniel knew he should call it in. A Kesh patrol would come, take the creature away, or more likely leave it to die since a hatchling with a twisted wing had no value to them. That was the rule out here. Nothing without value survived. He climbed down anyway. The hatchling flinched hard when his boots hit the metal floor, pressing itself into the corner, baring small teeth that shook more than they threatened. Daniel stayed where he was, hands open, the way you might approach a hurt dog. He had learned that trick from old Sam, who always said animals could smell fear and anger the same way they smelled blood. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, more out of habit than any belief the thing understood him. He had a strip of dried meat in his jacket pocket, the kind the outpost handed out as ration, tough and salty and barely food at all. He tore off a small piece and set it on his open palm, then held his hand out as far as his arm would let him, staying low, staying still. For a long moment nothing happened. The hatchling's eyes, a pale yellow with no white to them at all, stayed locked on him, its chest rising and falling too fast. Then slowly it uncurled just enough to stretch its neck forward. It sniffed the air near his hand twice, and then its jaws closed gently around the meat and pulled it from his palm. Daniel did not move. He barely let himself breathe. The hatchling chewed, swallowed, and looked at him again, and this time the fear in its eyes had changed into something closer to waiting. He gave it another piece, and another, until the meat was gone, and the whole time the creature never tried to bite his fingers, never pulled away once it understood what he was offering. When he finally reached out and rested his hand near its head, it did not flinch. It leaned into his palm just slightly, the way a tired animal leans into warmth. That was when Daniel made the decision that would change everything, though he did not know it yet. He took off his outer jacket, wrapped the hatchling inside it as gently as he could manage with its broken wing, and carried it out of the wreck hidden against his chest. The other men were too busy with the transport's cargo crates to notice one more piece of debris being carried away. He told himself he would figure out what to do with it later. Maybe leave it somewhere safe. Maybe report it once its wing healed enough that a Kesh patrol finding it would not simply mean its death. He told himself a lot of things on the long walk back to the outpost, the small weight against his chest rising and falling with each breath it took. By the time he reached the tunnels beneath the outpost, the hatchling was asleep, its head tucked under his arm, trusting him completely in a way nothing on this planet had trusted him before. Daniel looked down at it for a long moment, feeling something shift inside his chest that he did not have a name for yet. He did not know that the old stories of this world spoke of exactly this moment. He only knew that somewhere behind him, unseen, an old man named Sam had watched him carry something wrapped in his jacket through the tunnel entrance, and had gone very still and very quiet. Old Sam had lived on Dorland's Reach longer than anyone else in the outpost, and that meant people listened when he had something to say, even if what he said made no sense at first. He found Daniel 2 nights after the wreck, sitting alone in the lower tunnel with the hatchling curled against his side. And instead of shouting or panicking like Daniel expected, the old man just lowered himself down slowly onto the cold floor and looked at the creature for a long time without speaking. "You know what happens if Grisk finds out you've got that," Sam said finally. "I know," Daniel said. He did not look up from the small splint he was tying around the hatchling's wing, using a strip of metal from a broken cart and cloth torn from his own shirt. "I'm going to let it heal. Then I'll figure something out." Sam made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You don't figure something out with a dragon, boy. You just find out what it wants to be." That was the first time Daniel heard the word dragon used seriously, not as a nickname the outpost used for the Scytharn, but as something older. Over the following days, while the hatchling slept curled against a stack of old blankets in the hidden storage room beneath the tunnels, Sam began telling him things Daniel had never heard before, not even from his own parents before they died in the crash years ago. Sam said that before the Kesh ever came to this world, there had been a people here, not human, not Kesh, but something else entirely, something that had lived and worked alongside the Scytharn the same way a farmer works alongside a horse that trusts him. Sam said the old records, the ones the Kesh had tried hard to erase, spoke of a bond formed not through chains or fear, but through hands and patience, feeding a hatchling until it chose to stay rather than being forced to. "They're not animals," Sam said one evening, watching the hatchling stir in its sleep. "Not the way the Kesh want us to think. They remember. Somewhere in that skull, they remember what it used to be like before somebody put a collar on them." Daniel did not know how much of that to believe, but he could see for himself that something about the creature was different than he expected. It learned fast. Within a week, it understood the sound of his footsteps well enough to lift its head before he even entered the room. It learned to nudge his hand when it wanted food instead of snapping or clawing, and it made a soft clicking sound in its throat whenever he sat beside it, a sound that reminded him a little of a cat purring, though nothing about the creature looked like a cat at all. He started calling it Soot, because of the ash-gray color of its scales, and because it felt wrong to keep calling something that slept curled against his side it. Ruya was not as gentle about the situation as Sam had been. She was the closest thing the outpost had to a leader, a sharp-eyed woman who had kept most of them alive through years of Kesh cruelty by making hard, careful decisions, and she found out about Soot on the same day the wing splint came off. "You've lost your mind," she told Daniel flatly, standing in the doorway of the storage room with her arms crossed. "You know what they do to us if they find contraband. You know what they do if they find out we're hiding one of their animals." "It's not their animal," Daniel said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "Not anymore." Ruya looked at Soot for a long moment. The hatchling, wary of the new voice, had backed against Daniel's leg, watching her with its pale yellow eyes but making no move to run or attack. Something about the way it pressed close to him instead of hiding made Ruya's expression shift, just slightly, from anger into something more careful. "It's growing fast," she said instead of arguing further. "Too fast. That's not normal for a hatchling this age, even for a scytharn." She was right, and Daniel had noticed it too. In just over 2 weeks, Soot had grown enough that its head now reached past his knee, and its wings, once folded and fragile, had begun to show real strength when it stretched them out in the small room. Sam, when told, only nodded slowly as if he had expected exactly this. "It's the bond," he said. "The old stories say a dragon raised by a trusted hand grows faster, stronger than one raised in a kesh pen. They don't feed on food alone. They feed on trust." That night, a Kesh patrol swept unusually close to the outpost's eastern tunnels, checking storage areas for stolen parts after a theft was reported at the scrapyard. Daniel heard the heavy footsteps and mechanical voices echo down the corridor above, and he pressed himself flat against the wall of the storage room with Soot held tight against his chest, one hand covering its snout to keep it silent. Soot did not struggle. It went completely still, its heartbeat hammering fast against Daniel's palm, but it made no sound at all, as if it understood exactly what silence meant right now. The footsteps passed. The patrol moved on without checking the lower tunnel. When it was finally safe to breathe again, Daniel looked down at Soot, and Soot looked back up at him, and something passed between them that felt less like an animal trusting its keeper and more like two creatures who had just survived something together. Ruya, watching from the doorway where she had come to warn him about the patrol, said nothing more that night. She only looked at Soot a moment longer, then turned and walked away without another word about reporting him. The first time Soot tried to fly, it knocked over 3 crates and gave Daniel a bruise on his shoulder that lasted a week. It happened late at night, in the widest of the storage tunnels, after Soot had grown large enough that the small back room could no longer hold it comfortably. Daniel had led it there in secret, one careful step at a time, keeping close to the shadows in case a patrol passed overhead. Soot did not need much encouragement. The moment it had room to move, it spread its wings, wider now than Daniel's outstretched arms, and threw itself upward with a strength that surprised them both. It only made it a few feet before it lost balance and crashed sideways into a stack of crates, sending scrap metal clattering across the floor loud enough that Daniel's heart nearly stopped in his chest. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Soot let out a soft, embarrassed sound, something between a growl and a whine, and pushed itself back up, shaking dust from its wings like nothing had happened at all. Daniel could not help but laugh, quiet and disbelieving, as he helped stack the crates back the way they had been. "You're going to get us both killed," he whispered, but there was no real fear in it anymore, only the tired affection of someone who had already accepted what his life had become. By this point, Soot was no longer a small thing that could be hidden inside a jacket. It had grown at a pace that even Sam, with all his old stories, seemed uneasy about. Its scales had darkened from pale ash gray to something closer to true black, catching faint light along their edges like polished stone. Its eyes, once simple yellow, now held flecks of deeper gold that seemed to shift depending on its mood. Sam said this was not just growth. This was awakening, the kind the old stories only whispered about, the kind that happened when a bond was real rather than forced. "They grow into what they're allowed to become," Sam told Daniel one evening, watching Soot pace restlessly along the tunnel wall, testing its wings against the stale air. "In the Kesh pens, they're kept small and slow, fed just enough to survive, worked half to death before they're even grown. Out here with you, it's got nothing holding it back. That's what's changing it. Not food, freedom." Daniel did not fully understand what that meant, not yet, but he began to notice something strange happening beyond the walls of the outpost. The captive Scytharn herds, the ones kept chained near the Kesh processing stations at the edge of the colony, had grown restless. Word passed quietly among the human workers who handled cargo near the pens, whispers about animals refusing commands they had obeyed without question for years, about handlers being thrown from their backs for the first time anyone could remember, about low sounds carrying across the night air that no one could explain. Keeper Velm, the cache handler responsible for the largest pen near the colony's center, had noticed it too. He was an older cache, more superstitious than most of his kind, and he had spent enough years around the Skytharn to sense when something was wrong even if he could not name it. He walked the pens each night now, watching the herd stare toward the human sector in the darkness, wings twitching, heads lifted as if listening for something only they could hear. None of them, not Velm, not Grisk, not any of the Kesh administrators running the colony, understood that the source of the unrest was a single hatchling hidden beneath the human outpost, growing stronger every day on nothing more than trust and a hand willing to feed it without demanding obedience in return. Ruya, who had once argued hardest against keeping Soot alive, found herself changing in ways she had not expected. She began bringing extra rations to the storage tunnel without being asked, claiming it was only practical, since a hungry Skytharn was more dangerous than a fed one. But Daniel noticed the way she watched Soot now, not with suspicion, but with something closer to quiet wonder, especially the evening Soot pressed its large head gently against her hand the way it did with Daniel, accepting her presence without needing to be told she was safe. "It knows things," Ruya admitted that night, sitting beside Daniel in the tunnel while Soot slept nearby, its breathing slow and steady. "It knows who's afraid and who isn't. It knows who means it harm. I don't know how, but it does." "Sam says it's the bond," Daniel said. "Says it's older than the Kesh, older than any of us. Says a Skytharn raised on trust instead of chains remembers something the Kesh tried to make it forget." Ruya was quiet for a long moment, watching Soot's chest rise and fall in the dim light. "If that's true," she said finally, "then the Kesh have no idea what they're sitting on." Daniel thought about that long after Ruya had gone to sleep, sitting alone in the tunnel with Soot's head resting heavy against his leg. He thought about the restless herds near the processing stations, about Veln's nightly patrols, about how close they had already come to discovery more than once. He knew, somewhere beneath the quiet comfort of these stolen months, that this could not stay hidden forever. Soot was too large now, too strong, too alive in a way nothing born inside a Kesh pen was ever supposed to be. That night, for the first time, Daniel let Soot fly properly, leading it up through an old ventilation shaft to the surface under cover of darkness, out where the open sky stretched wide and empty above the wastes. Soot's first real flight was clumsy but strong, wings beating hard against the night air, lifting them both, just for a few seconds, off the ground and into something that felt, for the first time since the crash that stranded his family here, like freedom. Watching from below, hands shaking, Daniel understood that whatever came next, there was no going back to hiding this forever. Keeper Veln had spent 30 years around the Skytharn, and in all that time, he had never once seen a herd behave the way this one had over the past few weeks. It started small, animals refusing to be harnessed, then grew into something he could no longer explain away as bad weather or poor feeding. 3 nights ago, an adult had thrown its rider clean off its back for no reason at all, then simply stood there afterward, staring toward the human sector of the colony as if waiting for something. Veln reported his concerns to Overseer Grisk, expecting to be dismissed, since Grisk cared little for the superstitions of an old handler. Instead, Grisk listened carefully, because productivity numbers from the pens had dropped for 3 straight cycles. And numbers were the one thing Grisk always cared about. He ordered a full sweep of the human outpost, officially searching for stolen parts, unofficially searching for anything that might explain the sudden unrest among the herd. The sweep found Soot on a gray, windless morning, in the widest storage tunnel where Daniel had brought it to stretch its wings before the outpost woke for the day's shift. There was no warning. One moment the tunnel was quiet, the next it was filled with the harsh mechanical voices of Kesh guards, and the beam of handheld lights sweeping across black scales, far too large to belong to any hidden pet. Daniel stepped between Soot and the guards without thinking, arms spread, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Soot pressed close against his back, wings half raised, a low sound building in its chest that had never once been directed at him. "Step aside," the lead guard said, weapon raised. "That creature belongs to the Imperium." "It doesn't belong to anyone," Daniel said, and even as the words left his mouth he understood how little that would matter here. Grisk arrived within the hour, standing at the tunnel entrance with the cold, unhurried calm of someone who had already decided the outcome before he walked in. He looked at Soot for a long moment, taking in its size, its darkened scales, the way it stood angled protectively in front of the human who had raised it, and something in his expression shifted from irritation into calculation. "Interesting," Grisk said. "A defective hatchling grown well beyond normal rates, refusing separation from a human handler. This will need to be studied." He turned to the guards. "Take the creature to processing. Take this one," he nodded toward Daniel, "to holding. The rest of the outpost's rations will be cut by half until I decide whether this was an isolated act or something larger." What happened next was not part of Grisk's plan. When the guards moved to restrain Soot, it did not run, and it did not attack blindly the way a frightened animal might. It planted itself firmly beside Daniel and refused to move, meeting each attempt to force it forward with a low, warning growl that made even the armored guards hesitate. It took 4 of them, using restraint poles and a great deal of effort, to finally drag it away, and the entire time its eyes stayed locked on Daniel until the tunnel curve broke the line of sight between them. Daniel was beaten before he even reached the holding cell, not out of any specific cruelty, but simply because that was how Kesh guards handled prisoners who caused trouble. He was thrown into a small, windowless room somewhere beneath the colony's administrative building, left with cracked ribs and a split lip, and no way of knowing what had happened to Soot. He learned later, from old Sam, who had bribed a sympathetic worker for scraps of information, that Soot had been caged separately near the processing pens, and that it had refused every attempt to feed it since being taken. It would not eat from Kesh handlers, would not respond to commands, would not even lie down to rest, spending its hours packing the length of its cage with its eyes fixed toward the direction of the holding cells where Daniel was kept. What none of the Kesh understood, not Grisk, not Velm, not any of the handlers assigned to manage the growing crisis in the pens, was that Soot's defiance was not staying contained to a single cage. The bond that had grown between Daniel and Soot over these months was not simply personal. It moved through the herd like something felt rather than heard, an unease spreading among the other captive Scytharn who had never known anything but chains and fear, as if some old memory buried deep in their instincts had just been shaken loose. Handlers reported animals refusing food across 3 separate pens that same week. 2 more riders were thrown. A shipment meant to carry processed fuel off-world was delayed when the transport beasts refused to move past the loading gates no matter how they were driven or threatened. Velm stood at the edge of the largest pen one night, watching the herd stare in unbroken silence toward the direction of Soot's cage, and felt, for the first time in 30 years of working with these creatures, something close to fear. "They're waiting," he told Grisk the next morning, though he could not fully explain what he meant by it, only that the word felt true the moment he said it. Deep beneath the administrative building, in a cell with no light and no comfort, Daniel pressed his back against the cold wall and listened to the distant, muffled sounds of the colony above him. He did not know that Soot had stopped eating. He did not know that the herds were growing restless in ways the Kesh could not control. He only knew that somewhere out there, something he loved was suffering because of a choice he had made months ago in the wreck of a crashed transport, and that he would do everything in his power to reach it again, whatever that took. Old Sam, watching the growing unease across the colony from the shadows of the outpost, understood something the Kesh did not. This was not the end of the story the old legend spoke of. This was only the beginning of something the Kesh had never prepared for, because they had never believed the Scytharn capable of remembering what they once were. Ruya had never planned to lead a rescue. She had spent years keeping the outpost alive by staying quiet, by teaching everyone around her that survival meant not drawing attention. But the night after word reached her that Soot had stopped eating, she found herself standing in front of the remaining outpost workers, explaining a plan that would have gotten her laughed out of the room only months earlier. "They've cut our rations. They've locked up one of our own. They're already treating us like the enemy," she said, keeping her voice low in the tunnel where they had gathered in secret. "The only thing we haven't tried is acting like it's true." The plan came together using the one advantage the outpost had always held over the Kesh without the Kesh ever realizing it: Daniel's skill with machines. He was not there to build it himself, but Sam and two other workers who had spent years watching him work in the scrapyard knew enough of his methods to piece together a crude device from salvaged transport parts, something designed to overload the security relay controlling the holding block's outer doors. It was not elegant, it was not safe, but it was built by people who had nothing left to lose. They moved just before the last hour of darkness, when the colony's guard rotation was thinnest, and the administrative building's outer patrols were focused on the pens rather than the holding cells. Sam guided them through service tunnels he had mapped from decades of quiet observation, tunnels the Kesh had never bothered to fully seal because they assumed no human would be foolish enough to use them. The overload device worked better than any of them expected, blowing out the relay in a shower of sparks that killed the lights across the entire holding block for nearly a full minute. In the chaos and darkness that followed, Ruya and two others slipped past the stunned guards and reached the cell block corridor, calling Daniel's name in urgent whispers until a voice, rough and disbelieving, answered from behind a locked door near the end of the hall. Daniel was in worse shape than Ruya expected, his face bruised, one arm held stiff against his side, but he was on his feet the moment the door opened, moving with a desperate energy that had nothing to do with his own safety. "Soot," he said immediately. "Where's Soot?" "Processing pens, east side," Sam answered, already moving. "We don't have much time before the backup power kicks in." They reached the pens as the first gray light of early dawn began to touch the horizon, and what they found there stopped Daniel cold. Soot's cage sat in the center of a holding yard surrounded by a dozen other cages, all containing adult Scytharn, and every single one of them was awake, straining silently against restraints, eyes fixed in the same direction as Soot's, toward the sound of Daniel's approaching footsteps. Soot was weak. Days without food had drained the strength that had grown so quickly under Daniel's care, and when it saw him approaching through the dim light, it could barely lift its head at first. But the moment Daniel's hand touched the cage bars, something changed. Soot's eyes sharpened. Its chest rose with a breath that seemed to pull strength from somewhere deep inside itself, and with a sound that was half roar and half something closer to relief, it threw itself against the cage door hard enough to buckle the weakened lock Sam's overload had already strained. The door gave way. Soot staggered free, unsteady but alive, pressing its head hard against Daniel's chest the way it had done as a hatchling, trembling with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with weakness of spirit. And then all around them, the other cages began to shake. It was not planned, not coordinated by anything Daniel or Ruya understood, but the sight of Soot breaking free, the sound of that half-roar echoing across the holding yard, seemed to reach something buried deep in every other captive Scytharn within earshot. Restraints groaned under sudden, furious strength. Locks built for animals that had never once tried to fight back began failing under weight and force they were never designed to hold. Guards poured into the yard as the alarms finally caught up with the chaos, but by then it was already too late to contain. A dozen adult Scytharn, freed within moments of each other, turned not on the humans standing frozen near Soot's broken cage, but on the guards and handlers who had spent years driving them into obedience. Grisk arrived in the middle of the chaos, weapon drawn, face twisted with a fury that had nothing calculated left in it. He found Daniel standing beside Soot, one hand pressed against the creature's side, and raised his weapon with clear intent, only for Soot to move faster than its exhausted state should have allowed, placing its own body between the weapon and the human it had chosen months ago in the wreckage of a crashed transport. "Enough!" Ruya's voice cut across the yard, and Daniel realized she had circled behind Grisk during the chaos, holding a length of salvaged cable wired directly into the yard's power relay, sparks jumping from its exposed end. "Lower it, or I light up every cage door left standing." Grisk hesitated only a moment, but a moment was enough. Soot's growl deepened, low and final, and somewhere behind Grisk, 3 more cages gave way at once, the freed Scytharn inside them rising up with wings spread wide against the growing light of dawn. Grisk lowered his weapon, not out of mercy, but because even he could see, in that moment, exactly how badly the numbers had turned against him. By the time the sun cleared the horizon fully, the holding yard was empty of cages that still held anything, and the sky above the colony had begun to fill, wing by wing, with shapes rising higher and higher into the pale morning light, shapes that no longer answered to any chain the Kesh had ever built. By mid-morning, Dorland's Reach no longer looked like a colony under Kesh control. It looked like something being unmade, piece by piece, from the sky down. The freed Scytharn had not scattered randomly once the sun rose fully over the wastes. They had gathered, circling higher and higher above the processing station in numbers that grew by the hour as word, or instinct, or something older than either, spread outward toward the smaller outlying pens scattered across the territory. What had started as a dozen animals breaking loose in a single holding yard had become, within a few short hours, a rising tide that no Kesh security force on the ground had any real answer for. Daniel stood near the edge of the yard with one hand still resting against Soot's side, watching the sky fill with shapes he had never imagined seeing free all at once. Soot was still weak from days without food, but it stood tall beside him now, wings half spread, head lifted toward the growing numbers of its own kind circling above, and Daniel could feel, even without understanding exactly how, that something in the creature had changed permanently. This was not an animal anymore, if it had ever truly been one to begin with. This was something remembering itself. "They're not attacking the colony," Ruya said, coming to stand beside him, cable still gripped in one hand, though the sparks had long since died out. "They're just leaving." She was right. The Scytharn were not turning their fury on the buildings or the fleeing workers below. They were simply rising, gathering, and beginning to move outward, away from the pens and processing stations that had held them for generations, toward the open wilderness beyond the colony's reach, a place no Kesh fence or chain had ever managed to touch. It was not vengeance driving them. It was something closer to a door finally opening after being sealed for far too long. Grisk's forces, already thin and now facing both an uprising in the sky and a human outpost no longer willing to stand quietly aside, made the only choice left available to them. Within the hour, official withdrawal orders came down from the colony's command center, guards pulling back from the pens entirely, focusing instead on securing what remained of the processing equipment before it too was lost to the chaos spreading outward from the yard. Grisk himself was found later that day by his own soldiers, stripped of authority by an emergency order from higher command, blamed for allowing an entire generation of captive assets to escape under his watch. Whatever punishment awaited him within the Kesh Imperium's own cold bureaucracy, it was no longer Daniel's concern, nor Ruya's, nor anyone else's from the outpost. What mattered now was what came next, not what had been left behind. Old Sam found them both near sunset, standing at the edge of what had once been the processing yard, now empty and silent except for the wind. He looked older than Daniel had ever seen him, but there was something steady in his expression too, something that looked almost like peace. "The old stories never said how it would happen," Sam said, looking up at the last few skytharns still visible against the darkening sky, small dark shapes catching the final orange light of the setting sun. Just that it would someday, if someone remembered how to offer an open hand instead of a chain. Daniel did not answer right away. He was tired in a way that went far past his body, past the bruises and the cracked ribs the guards had left him with. But when he looked down at Soot, now resting on the ground beside him with its head against his knee, breathing slow and steady for the first time in days, he understood, finally, exactly what all of this had cost, and exactly what it had bought them in return. "What happens now?" Ruya asked, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Now," Sam said, "we find out if a species that just remembered how to be free decides humans are worth remembering too." The answer came the next morning at true dawn, when Daniel walked out from the outpost's ruin gate to find the sky above Dorland's reach filled from horizon to horizon with wings. Thousands of them, more than he had ever imagined the colony's pens could have held, circling low over the human outpost in wide, slow arcs, neither attacking nor fleeing, simply present, simply watching. Soot rose unsteadily to stand beside him, lifting its head toward the gathered mass of its own kind, and let out a call unlike anything Daniel had heard from it before, deep and resonant, carrying easily across the open ground. The sky answered. Thousands of voices rose together in response, a sound that shook dust loose from the broken fences and sent birds, real earth birds descended from the original colony ship, scattering from what few trees remained standing near the outpost. It was not a threat. Daniel understood that immediately, standing there with his hand resting on Soot's side, feeling the vibration of that massive, shared call pass through the ground beneath his boots. It was recognition. It was the sound of a species finally free enough to choose who it stood beside, rather than who it had been forced to serve. Ruya stepped up beside him, and Sam beside her, and one by one the rest of the outpost gathered at the broken gate to watch the sky fill with wings that no longer belonged to anyone but themselves. For the first time in 6 years, since the crash that had stranded them here with nothing, Daniel felt something other than survival settle into his chest, something he had almost forgotten the shape of. Soot pressed close against him, strong again, growing still, no longer a secret hidden beneath tunnels but a living symbol standing in open daylight. And Daniel understood that whatever came next for Dorland's reach, for the Kesh Imperium's broken hold on this world, for the small, stubborn outpost of humans who had refused to disappear quietly, it would begin here, at dawn, with a sky full of wings that remembered exactly what freedom felt like, because one man had once been foolish enough and kind enough to feed a starving hatchling from his own hand instead of turning away.